The room was still, the kind of stillness that hums with tension just before something unforgettable happens. The polished oak benches gleamed under the courtroom lights. Every whisper long vanished as Justice William Alsup leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a smirk that felt centuries old. His laughter, brief, dismissive, cutting, broke the air like a crack in glass. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy, carrying the weight of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She stood behind the podium, her notes untouched, her voice calm even as his echo lingered. For a split second, the courtroom wasn't about law or precedent. It was about power, and who dared to claim it. Alsup's laughter wasn't just amusement. It was a challenge, a warning dressed as humor. The attorneys seated nearby glanced down at their papers, pretending not to notice. But Crockett noticed everything. The flicker in his eyes, the deliberate pause meant to unnerve her, the old rhythm of authority testing the new. Her stillness became its own kind of defiance. She let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of intent. Somewhere, a reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. The tension felt alive now, electric, as though everyone in the room could sense what was about to happen. Jasmine's expression didn't harden. It focused when she finally spoke. Her words didn't rise or tremble. They landed with precision, each syllable sharpened by restraint. In that instant, the laugh that once commanded the room began to shrink. Viewers watching later wouldn't remember the smirk or the bench. They'd remember the reversal, because what Jasmine Crockett said next didn't just silence the judge. It rewrote the moment. If moments like this make your heart race, when truth stands tall against arrogance, hit subscribe now. Your voice keeps stories like this alive. The one's power hopes you'll forget. Comment accountability matters if you believe respect must be earned, not demanded. Together, we make justice impossible to ignore. Justice William Alsup has spent decades behind the bench, a figure both respected and feared in equal measure. Appointed in the late 1990s, he built a reputation for intellectual rigor and an unshakable command of his courtroom. Attorneys who appeared before him often described him as brilliant but impatient, the kind of judge who valued logic over emotion and authority over conversation. He was known to cut off arguments mid-sentence, to laugh when a lawyer's reasoning struck him as naive, to remind everyone that this was his courtroom, his tempo, his law. To many, that kind of confidence read as mastery. To others, it read as dismissal, a symptom of how the justice system often confuses arrogance with expertise. Jasmine Crockett entered that same legal world from the opposite side of the power spectrum. Before she became a congresswoman, she was a public defender in Dallas, representing those who couldn't afford counsel. Her experience wasn't theoretical, it was personal. She'd seen how the tone of a judge could shift depending on the defendant's skin color, how respect in the courtroom often depended less on evidence and more on identity. When she transitioned to politics, she carried that clarity with her. The understanding that law, as practiced, is as much about human behavior as it is about statutes. Their encounter wasn't random. It was generational, institutional, even cultural, the embodiment of two Americas colliding. On one side sat the establishment, older, white, steeped in precedent and hierarchy. On the other stood a younger, black woman who had built her career by refusing to shrink in the face of authority. Crockett's presence in that courtroom represented the evolution of justice itself. Not just who gets to speak, but who gets to be heard. When Alsup laughed, it wasn't merely a reaction to her legal theory. It was the echo of decades of inherited power. The courtroom, in that instant, became a stage where America's deeper struggle played out. The old language of dominance against the new dialect of accountability. What he dismissed as audacious, she defended as necessary. And in that contrast lay the real story. Crockett's legal theory wasn't about ego. It was about examining how structural bias influences judicial outcomes, even when those biases hide behind technical language. Her argument challenged the assumption that the system was neutral. To her, neutrality without equity was just another form of complicity. It wasn't an attack on one man, it was an invitation for reflection within an institution that rarely reflects on itself. That's what made this moment resonate. Viewers didn't just see a judge and a lawyer. They saw a symbol of America's generational reckoning. They saw what happens when a voice trained by the margins speaks truth inside a space built to silence it. Alsup's courtroom became a mirror, forcing everyone, from clerks to viewers at home, to confront how easily confidence can masquerade as correctness. And that's why her composure mattered so deeply. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She let the system reveal itself through its own discomfort. That restraint wasn't passivity, it was strategy. The quiet defiance of someone who's had to earn every inch of respect she's ever received. By the time the clip began spreading online, the debate had already transcended law. It became about what justice looks like when someone who has lived its failures refuses to be lectured about its limits. What unfolded between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Alsup wasn't just a courtroom exchange. It was a confrontation between power and perspective, and for once, perspective refused to yield. The tension didn't erupt all at once. It built slowly, like heat gathering under glass. Jasmine Crockett's voice was measured, each word deliberate, her rhythm calm but unyielding. She began outlining her argument, that procedural bias, even when unintentional, perpetuates systemic discrimination in the justice system. It wasn't a claim made lightly. She cited precedents, data, and rulings that most courtroom spectators had never heard of, stitching them together into something that felt less like a theory and more like a reckoning. At first, Justice Alsup listened. His fingers drummed softly against the wood of his bench, a steady, almost imperceptible rhythm. But with each paragraph, his posture stiffened. He glanced briefly toward his clerk, then leaned back, lips pressing into what could only be described as a restrained smile. It wasn't approval, it was amusement, the kind reserved for those who think they already know how the story ends. "Ms. Crockett," he interrupted once, voice edged with familiarity that bordered on condescension. "I think we all understand the general principle here." The room seemed to tighten. Crockett didn't interrupt back. She simply nodded, a faint smile curving her lips. Not agreement, but acknowledgement. Then she continued, seamlessly folding his dismissal into her next point. She wasn't there to win his approval. She was there to be understood. Her argument shifted gears, moving from theory to application. She described how procedural discretion, wielded unevenly, can cement inequity. Her tone carried the quiet certainty of someone who has lived what she's describing. And that was the difference. This wasn't an academic exercise. It was testimony disguised as legal reasoning. Alsup's eyes narrowed. He exhaled through his nose, the sound almost imperceptible but unmistakably irritated. His pen tapped faster. Another interruption came, softer this time, disguised as a question. "So, in your view, the court itself can perpetuate bias even when following established procedure?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. Especially then." A murmur rippled across the back row, reporters shifting in their seats, sensing something unusual. There was no disrespect in her tone, but there was no deference either. That alone made the air in the room feel different. She pressed forward, explaining how systemic bias survives not through explicit prejudice, but through procedural habits. Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Whose words carry authority? Whose experiences are treated as anecdotal instead of evidentiary? Her words peeled away layers of institutional comfort, exposing the human judgment beneath every ruling. By now, Alsup's chuckles had stopped being subtle. He leaned forward slightly, interjecting with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "That's quite the sociological perspective, Ms. Crockett," he said. "But we deal in law here." The room's silence turned heavier, the kind that makes even the air hesitate. Jasmine looked up, met his gaze, and smiled again. This time, broader, warmer, almost kind. "Exactly, Your Honor," she said softly. "That's why it matters." Somewhere in the back, a young law student's hand tightened around their pen. They knew what they were watching wasn't in any textbook. Outside the courtroom, a clerk refreshed their phone. The first clip, a 20-second snippet of Alsup's laugh, was already on social media. The caption read, "Judge laughs at rep. Jasmine Crockett's legal theory." Within minutes, it had thousands of views, comment sections filled with the familiar split, those who saw her as outmatched, and those who saw her as brave enough to step into a lion's den with only her conviction for armor. But the full moment hadn't arrived yet. Inside the courtroom, Jasmine continued, every sentence sharpening the tension. Alsup's amusement was beginning to look like discomfort, his earlier composure fraying at the edges. To the casual observer, it still looked like a standard exchange between a confident judge and an ambitious advocate. But to those paying attention, to those who knew the rhythm of power, something fundamental was shifting. The laughter that had once filled the room now hung in memory, replaced by a new sound, the quiet rustle of people realizing that the underdog wasn't just holding her ground, she was changing it. The room had no idea she was about to flip the power dynamic entirely, just as Alsup's laughter cut through the room like a blade hidden in velvet. It wasn't the booming kind that filled space. It was tight, knowing, meant to slice quietly. "That's not how the law works, Ms. Crockett," he said, his voice carrying that polished confidence born of decades spent unchallenged. The courtroom stirred. A few observers smiled nervously, unsure whether to side with decorum or discomfort. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless for half a second. The pause wasn't hesitation, it was assessment. Her hand rested on the edge of the podium, fingers still, eyes locked on him. There was no anger in her face, no visible offense, just calm, the kind that unnerves men who mistake quiet for weakness. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and deliberate. "With respect, Your Honor, that's exactly how it works. Or at least, that's how it should." The words landed like the first drop before a storm. She turned slightly, enough to address the courtroom but never breaking eye contact with the bench. "The law," she continued, "is not static. It evolves through interpretation. And when interpretation is shaped by those who benefit most from its rigidity, bias becomes institutional, not incidental." Alsup leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Are you suggesting this court enforces bias?" "Not intentionally," she replied, "but consistently." The air shifted. A ripple of movement went through the room. Small gestures, exchanged glances, the creak of benches as people adjusted unconsciously. Every sound seemed magnified. Crockett flipped through her notes, not frantically but methodically. Turning to a bookmarked page, she began citing precedent. Batson v. Kentucky, United States v. Armstrong, Flowers v. Mississippi. Her tone carried no theatrics. It was the controlled precision of someone who'd had to argue every point twice, once for truth, once for validation. "In each of these cases," she said, "we saw the courts recognize bias not as an abstract concept but as a measurable harm. Yet, Your Honor, those same courts often stopped short of calling out their own participation in perpetuating it." Alsup opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but she continued, voice steady, unwavering. "When a system rewards consistency without reflection, it mistakes tradition for justice." That line hung in the air like incense. It didn't challenge authority. It questioned its foundation. Alsup's fingers tightened around his pen. He looked down briefly, then back up, that small glance signaling a shift. The laughter that had once punctuated his confidence had disappeared. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Ms. Crockett," he said, tone lower now, "you're walking a fine line between advocacy and accusation." "I know, Your Honor," she said, "but the truth always walks a fine line in rooms built to protect comfort." The audience didn't move. Even the hum of the air vents seemed quieter. Crockett's calm was disarming, not confrontational, an elegance that left no room for ridicule. She began outlining the core of her legal theory again, but this time with a different cadence. Every word felt sharpened by conviction. "Procedural neutrality isn't the absence of bias," she said. "It's the mask bias wears when it wants to look civilized." There it was, the line that would replay online 1,000 times. Someone in the gallery gasped softly. Alsup's hand froze mid-note. Crockett pressed forward, layering logic upon logic. "Our Constitution promises equal protection under the law, not equal access to procedures that preserve inequality. When due process becomes a shield for systemic imbalance, it ceases to serve justice and starts to serve precedent." Her argument wasn't emotional. It was surgical, each statement connected to a larger frame. Fairness, accountability, evolution. She didn't just quote the law. She made it breathe. Alsup shifted in his chair. His tone softened when he spoke again, less amused, more cautious. You're arguing for judicial reform within the framework of constitutional interpretation. That's a policy discussion, not a legal one, Crockett nodded. Policy becomes law, Your Honor, and law becomes legacy. If we separate the two, we stop history from learning. The room held its breath. Something unspoken had shifted. Alsup's posture, once commanding, now leaned forward, not in dominance, but in engagement. The power dynamic was tilting, subtle but undeniable. Her tone deepened. You've spent decades interpreting the Constitution. I respect that. But what I'm asking is whether interpretation can evolve without humility. If the law refuses to admit where it's been blind, how can it ever claim to see clearly? He didn't respond. His pen rested against the desk. Motionless, Crockett continued, her voice now steady as a metronome. This isn't about accusing courts of corruption or malice. It's about accountability, the kind that ensures the next generation doesn't inherit our blind spots. Because when we mock ideas that question power, we protect privilege instead of justice. The words were clinical, but the weight behind them was emotional. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Every sentence carried the discipline of someone who'd learned that emotion only becomes effective when it's controlled. At that moment, Alsup's smirk had vanished. His laughter, which began as the punctuation mark of authority, was now the ghost of an earlier arrogance. He exhaled, nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Proceed," he said quietly. And she did. She closed her binder and spoke from memory. No more citations, no more pages. Justice, she said, was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be corrective. Every time a courtroom resists reflection, it tells the next generation that accountability is optional. I don't believe it is. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was dense, alive. You could hear the faint shuffle of someone swallowing, the distant creak of the judge's chair as he leaned back. For the first time that day, Alsup didn't look down at his notes. He looked at her. Really looked. The transformation was subtle but seismic. The authority that had once radiated from the bench now emanated from the podium. Crockett hadn't raised her volume or broken decorum. She had simply refused to accept that composure equaled submission. In that reversal lay the power of the moment. Not that she defeated him, but that she redefined what strength in a courtroom looked like. Her logic didn't shout down his laughter. It rendered it irrelevant. When she finished, there was no applause. There never is in a courtroom. But those who witnessed it would remember the sound of something quieter, rarer, respect earned in real time, and as the judge's gavel tapped once, almost ceremonially, the moment sealed itself in memory. Laughter meeting logic, ego meeting evidence, and authority meeting its match. It started as a 47-second clip, grainy, recorded from the back of the courtroom on someone's phone. At first it looked ordinary. A judge, a lawyer, a few murmurs from the gallery. But then came the laugh, that unmistakable, sharp-edged chuckle, followed by Jasmine Crockett's pause and her now famous line, "Procedural neutrality isn't the absence of bias. It's the mask bias wears when it wants to look civilized." That single sentence lit up the internet. By evening, the clip was everywhere. TikTok, X, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts. The captions varied, but the sentiment didn't. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. The reactions were instantaneous and global. Commentators praised her composure. Activists called it a masterclass in grace under condescension, and law professors quietly added the clip to next semester's discussion. Syllabi. It wasn't just about what she said. It was how she said it, with the precision of a scalpel and the patience of someone who'd been underestimated too many times to count. Legal experts began breaking down her argument in threads that went viral on their own. One constitutional scholar wrote, "What Crockett did in 47 seconds was expose how respectability is often demanded to protect fragility, not fairness." Others noted how her measured tone dismantled the stereotype that emotional restraint equates to submission. It wasn't submission. It was strategy. And while the internet dissected her logic, the emotional reaction was something else entirely. Young women, especially women of color, flooded comment sections with gratitude, pride, and disbelief. "I've been laughed at in meetings like this," one wrote, but she didn't shrink. She didn't play nice to be accepted. She made the room adjust to her. Memes followed, of course. One showed Alsup's smirk dissolving into silence with the caption, "When you laugh at the wrong lawyer?" Another looped the moment he said, "That's not how the law works," cutting immediately to Crockett's reply, "Then maybe the law should learn." It was humorous, but beneath the humor was something potent. A shared sense of vindication. Cable news picked it up next. Anchors replayed the footage, pausing frame by frame to capture the shift. The moment laughter curdled into respect, one commentator said, "What we witnessed wasn't defiance for spectacle. It was intellectual courage." Overnight, Crockett went from congresswoman to cultural symbol, a reminder that quiet composure can be louder than outrage. But what made this moment viral wasn't just the clip itself. It was the echo. The way people shared it, not just because it was satisfying, but because it meant something. It became shorthand for anyone who had ever been talked over, doubted, dismissed. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was emotional justice made visible. Every retweet, every duet, every stitched reaction carried the same energy. That collective exhale of witnessing balance restored. If only for a moment. The story wasn't about humiliation. It was about reclamation. By morning, the clip had crossed 5 million views. By noon, politicians were commenting on it. By nightfall, late-night hosts had mentioned it in their monologues. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. No press statement, no follow-up interviews, no victory laps, just silence. And that silence said more than any response could. Because some moments don't need amplification. They carry their own volume. You'll wish you saw it live. Because no transcript, no replay, no retelling can capture the chill that filled that room. The instant power remembered it could be questioned. When the laughter stopped, the air in the courtroom felt heavier. Not hostile, just thick with awareness. Justice Alsup, once the commanding presence behind the bench, leaned back, cleared his throat, and adjusted his glasses. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that said more than any gavel strike ever could. His composure returned, but the authority that once felt absolute had subtly fractured. The room knew it. He knew it. What lingered wasn't embarrassment. It was realization. The kind that creeps in when someone used to being untouchable suddenly meets a force they didn't anticipate. Alsup tried to pivot, to regain the rhythm of control. Procedural reminders, clipped phrasing, an attempt to steer the conversation back to neutral ground. But neutrality couldn't erase what everyone had just witnessed. A moment where intellect and integrity overpowered status and seniority. Outside the courtroom, the images told their own story. A still frame of Alsup's glance downward went viral with the caption, "When respect stops being automatic." Another showed him mid-adjustment of his glasses, labeled simply, "Processing accountability." They weren't cruel. They were symbolic. For once, the visual language of power belonged to someone other than the man in the robe. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stayed quiet. No victory tweet, no celebratory post, no soundbite for hungry networks. When approached for interviews, her team offered a simple response. The record speaks for itself. And it did. Not just the legal record, but the emotional one written across millions of viewers' screens. Commentators noticed the restraint. She didn't capitalize on it. One journalist said, "She let the truth breathe." That decision, deliberate or instinctive, gave the moment more gravity. It wasn't about ego. It was about equilibrium, about resetting the idea that authority should be earned, not inherited, proven, not presumed. Inside legal circles, the discomfort was palpable. A few of Alsup's peers defended him, calling the viral frenzy overblown. Others quietly acknowledged what many had thought for years, that judicial decorum sometimes disguises condescension. But among the public, the interpretation was clear. They had seen a system designed to intimidate finally meet someone who refused to flinch. For ordinary people watching, It wasn't about one judge or one congresswoman. It was about possibility. The idea that even in rooms built to silence, truth could still find oxygen. The clip became a mirror. Some saw humiliation, others saw hope. But everyone saw change by the week's end. Alsup returned to his docket, his usual cadence restored. But the shadow of that moment lingered. Subtle yet permanent respect, he learned, isn't something a title guarantees. It's something earned, in real time, under the scrutiny of truth. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't need to say another word. The silence she left behind was its own kind of statement, calm, complete, and impossible to laugh away. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed, the echo of that moment refused to fade. What began as a tense legal exchange between a judge and a congresswoman transformed into something larger, a reckoning. On talk shows, podcasts, and classroom discussions, people weren't just replaying the video. They were unpacking it, frame by frame, word by word. This wasn't about spectacle anymore. It was about symbolism. Jasmine Crockett hadn't simply challenged a judge. She had disrupted a hierarchy that had long gone unquestioned, within days. The viral clip became a conversation starter in law schools across the country. Professors paused mid-lecture to play the exchange, asking students to analyze tone, posture, and the quiet assertion of authority that Crockett embodied. "What do you see here?" one asked a class at Howard University. A student replied, "I see a woman who didn't shrink." That phrase caught on. Soon it appeared on signs, stickers, and posts. She didn't shrink. The ripple effect extended beyond academia. Young women in politics, especially those of color, began referencing the moment as a turning point. "It told me I could speak, even if my voice shakes," one first-year law student tweeted. Others described it as validation, proof that sharp intellect could pierce through centuries of coded dismissal. For many, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's words that mattered, it was her composure. She had confronted arrogance not with outrage, but with evidence, and that distinction resonated deeply. Commentators drew historical parallels. They recalled Anita Hill, who faced disbelief in the 1990s for daring to name workplace harassment before a Senate that dismissed her pain as inconvenience. They mentioned Ketanji Brown Jackson, who during her confirmation hearings endured condescension masked as questioning, her patience becoming both shield and statement. Crockett's moment, they said, lived in that same lineage, women of color, standing at the intersection of intellect and disrespect, turning composure into resistance. But there was something unique this time, the speed and scale of public response. In Hill's era, sympathy built slowly, through op-eds and evening news segments. In Jackson's, through live-streamed hearings and clipped analyses. For Crockett, it happened in real time. Within hours, millions had seen it, shared it, and written their own captions. Justice was no longer filtered through gatekeepers. It was democratized, dissected, defended, and amplified by ordinary viewers who recognized the power dynamic instantly. Policy advocates seized the moment to renew calls for judicial accountability. Organizations that track courtroom conduct released new statements urging transparency in proceedings and decorum that respects litigants and representatives alike. What began as a single exchange evolved into a discussion about systemic reform, how implicit bias operates even in the most revered institutions. For Jasmine Crockett, the legacy wasn't about personal victory. In a quiet speech weeks later, she addressed a group of law interns. "The law," she said, "isn't just about who interprets it, it's about who feels seen by it." Her words landed softly but carried weight, because that, ultimately, was the legacy of the moment. Visibility. A reminder that confidence, clarity, and conscience can coexist even in rooms designed to test them. Justice Alsup's name faded from the headlines, but the symbolism endured. The smirk that once signified authority became shorthand for a generational shift. Power, when misused, now risked exposure not just in transcripts but in pixels and posts. And while some dismissed the viral moment as fleeting, others recognized it for what it truly was, a cultural checkpoint, a pause between what used to be tolerated and what would no longer pass unchallenged in the years ahead. That clip will likely resurface in documentaries, lectures, and think pieces about representation and reform. And when it does, viewers won't just remember a judge's laugh or a congresswoman's calm rebuttal. They'll remember the shift, the collective realization that brilliance never needed permission, only a moment to be heard. There's something quietly radical about staying calm when the world expects you to break. Jasmine Crockett's moment in that courtroom wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about redefining what strength looks like. No raised voice, no flash of anger, just composure so steady it disarmed arrogance itself. That kind of calm isn't passive. It's powerful. It tells the world, I don't need to match your noise to prove my worth. Audiences didn't share that clip because they love courtroom drama. They shared it because, deep down, we all crave evidence that integrity can still prevail, that listening can be louder than laughing, and dignity can still command a room. In an age of outrage, Crockett reminded us that restraint is not weakness, it's strategy. Every word she spoke was measured, rooted in truth, and that precision became its own kind of defiance. What makes moments like this resonate isn't just the takedown, it's the mirror they hold up to us. We've all faced condescension in some form, been underestimated, talked over, or dismissed. Watching someone respond with grace and intellect gives us permission to believe that patience and preparation still matter. It's not about silencing anyone, it's about being so grounded that the noise loses its power. When calm becomes power, laughter fades into learning. And when truth is spoken without fear, even arrogance has to listen. That's the lesson Jasmine Crockett left behind. That sometimes the most revolutionary sound in a room full of noise is a steady, unwavering voice refusing to bow. If you believe moments like this define real progress, when dignity outshines authority, share this story, subscribe, add your voice in the comments, and keep this truth moving forward. Justice begins where silence breaks, and today it broke. One steady voice, one laugh, one awakening at a time.